Good morning, and thank all of you for joining us today to discuss the Department of Veterans Affairs Medical and Prosthetic Research Program. Before I begin, I'd like to ask unanimous consent for our friend and fellow committee member, Congressman Kaufman from Colorado, to join us on the dais for today's proceeding. When he comes in, we'll seat him. Without objection, that's ordered. All right, well, current law requires the VA to conduct research in order to carry out and more effectively the primary function of the Veterans Health Administration in order to contribute to the nation's knowledge about disease and disability. The VA research program has attracted high-quality clinician researchers to VA medical centers and led to many important partnerships. This has resulted in discoveries that have benefited everybody in this room. You'll hear the VA tout some of these most notable discoveries this morning. They range from the pacemaker in 1959 to the shingles vaccine in 2006. Despite these successes, the committee has become increasingly concerned that the VA's research program is in need of refocusing in several important areas. First, it is not clear that the majority of the research that the VA conducts displays a concentrated focus on veteran-specific conditions and concerns. There are many valuable research topics such as obesity and heart disease that are very deserving of research dollars and attention. But the VA's research program is meant to support research on issues that are unique to or particularly prevalent among veterans and may not be receiving the funding and attention they deserve by other research entities. And these issues are such as toxic exposures, traumatic brain injuries, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Secondly, there are concerns that VA medical facilities are not complying with the VA policy by administering grants from outside entities through VA nonprofit research and education corporations to the extent that's possible. The vast majority of VA researchers are duly appointed at both a VA medical facility and a nearby academic affiliate, which can create conflicts of interest when it comes time to determine where a given grant is administered. There are significant financial considerations inherent in that determination, and the VA has to make sure that the department is given due consideration, not leaving a cent of potential research funding on the table and out of the veteran's reach. Finally, there are concerns that the VA is not getting a significant return on its investment in research overall. A statement from the record from the Vietnam Veterans of America said it perhaps most succinctly. How much of what VA research produced recently is of significant benefit to veterans? And I have no doubt that the VA researchers are leaders in their field, making great progress on a regular basis, but we're not sure that enough of what VA researchers are discovering is being translated efficiently and effectively into the VA medical centers and clinics to benefit veterans across the country. I'm grateful today for our witnesses for their attendance here this morning to discuss these issues with us. One thing I will note before yielding is that the Subcommittee on Health will be holding another hearing on June 8th that will focus specifically on burn pit research, and I'm looking forward to that and diving deeper into that specific research efforts at that hearing and not today. I will yield to Ranking Member Brownlee for any opening statement that she may have at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning, this subcommittee will delve into issues involving VA's mission to discover knowledge, develop researchers and healthcare leaders, and create innovations to advance healthcare for veterans and the nation. The successful advancement of this mission has positioned VA as the largest single provider of medical training in the United States. Today, over 70% of healthcare providers have received training through the VA. The partnerships VA has established with academic institutions and VA nonprofit corporations have proven integral to VA's advancement of veteran-centric research. VA's relationship to its academic affiliates is essential if VA is to provide the level of health care that we all expect for our veterans. This is why Congress, the VA, and its academic affiliates must work together to address areas that need improvement. While our overall healthcare system reaps the benefits of VA inventions, VA also benefits by being able to rely on the high-quality providers and specialists that this type of research attracts. VA physicians are often on the leading edge of medical knowledge and leaders in their field of practice. For instance, earlier this year, the Minneapolis VA published a study that found that opioid painkillers are no more effective than safer alternatives in long-term treatment of patients with chronic pain. Not only is this information timely, but it will likely shape federal policies surrounding the prescribing of opioids in the future and save thousands of Americans from falling victim to opioid addiction. Because of the important work VA's Office of Research and Development has accomplished, I wish to examine how we can better support VA research and research conducted by our academic affiliates and VA nonprofit research corporations. I'm concerned that VA's current research budget is not keeping pace with inflation, and if NIH awards significantly fewer research grants, this will have a negative effect on VA's ability to develop treatments for our veterans. If funding for VA research continues to be lacking, I want to know more about how VA can continue to leverage private investment and nonprofit funding through our nonprofit research corporations and through our academic affiliates to make up for federal research funding shortfalls. Finally, I want to continue to work with Ranking Member Custer and our colleagues across the aisle to ensure VA is properly overseeing its research programs and the administration of NIH-funded research through the VA nonprofits, research corporations, and its academic affiliates. I'd also like to better understand when it is appropriate for VA nonprofit corporations and academic affiliates to administer NIH grants and ensure VA is following its current policy directives. We need to come together to figure out the best way to ensure vital research to advance veterans' health care needs is funded and that it is administered properly so that this funding results in treatments that improve and, in some cases, save veterans' lives. Educating our nation's healthcare providers and developing medical breakthroughs to provide treatment to our veterans are part of VA's core mission. It is vital that we, as members of Congress, support this mission. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Dunn, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Representative Brownlee. Make note that Chairman Bergman and Ranking Member Custer will be making closing statements at the end of our hearing, and so I welcome our panel, and I'll introduce you now. First, we have Robin Rusconi, Chair of the Board of Directors for the National Association of Veterans Research and Education Foundations. Next, we have Dr. Paul Klotman, who's a nephrologist by training, the President and Chief Executive Officer and Dean of Baylor College of Medicine, and here on behalf of the Association of American Medical Colleges. And I'll make note that they are also the very first VA hospital ever. Also, Dr. Carolyn Clancy, Executive in charge of the Veterans Health Administration for the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, and who is accompanied also by Dr. Rachel Ramoni, VA's Chief Research and Development Officer. Welcome, panel. We thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. And Mrs. Rusconi, I believe we'll start with you, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Bergman and Dunn, Ranking Members Custer and Brownlee, distinguished members of the subcommittees, thank you for holding this important hearing. VA research is an essential but underpublicized element of the VA healthcare system. It has a distinguished history of discovery and innovation that has benefited veterans and the nation for over 90 years. The congressionally authorized VA-affiliated nonprofit corporations are proud to support and augment VA research. My name is Robin Rusconi. Since 2014, I have been the executive director of the VA-affiliated nonprofit corporation located in Kansas City, Missouri. I am currently the chair of the board of directors for the National Association of Veterans Research and Education Foundations, known as NAVREF. As a child of 2 World War II veterans, I am proud to be supporting the VA research program and helping improve the lives of veterans. NAVREF's mission is simple. We exist to advance the success of the VA-affiliated nonprofit corporations. I am here today to tell you about the great work of our nonprofits, our potential for greater contributions, and the progress made since last year's hearing. We are pleased that the House Veterans Affairs Committee recognizes the importance of the nonprofit corporations in the VA research enterprise. Over the last 4 years alone, the NPCs have administered over $1 billion in support of the research and education activities at VA medical centers. NAVRAF and its members are excited, too, to support Dr. Ramoni's 3 strategic priorities for VA research: to provide greater access to clinical trials for veterans, to make VA data a national resource, and to achieve substantial real-world impact. While NAVREF is proud of all the NPCs have accomplished, we feel they have the potential to make even greater contributions. In June 2017, the House Veterans Affairs Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee held a hearing about VA research that included testimony from NAVREF. During that testimony, NAVREF made several recommendations. I'd like to update you on the progress made on 2 of those recommendations. First of all, we were heartened to hear that the Office of Research and Development would engage an outside consultant to assess the need for VA to establish and enforce clear guidelines for administering federal awards. Unfortunately, we are frustrated that the process has moved slowly, and we are concerned that the perspective of the nonprofit corporation is not being fully investigated and appreciated. We believe the VA should enforce clear guidelines for the administration of extramural research activities that offer the NPC right of first refusal for all research efforts when the majority of this work occurs physically within the VA. Second, the VA's Nonprofit Oversight Board took several positive steps last October regarding the oversight reviews being conducted by the Nonprofit Program Office. Specifically, the NPOB created a clear appeals process, established an anonymous survey tool to receive feedback, and ensured oversight review outbriefs include the full board of directors and the executive director of the nonprofit corporation. Each of these changes have been in place for a short time, so it is too early to determine if they have been effectively communicated to local VA leadership and if they will have their intended impact. Additionally, we'd like to see greater clarity on the scope of these reviews. Our members, all independent 501c3 corporations, remain confused about what is subject to VA review and what may be out of scope. Thank you again for your attention to these matters. We greatly appreciate your continuing support of the VA research program and your support of the VA-affiliated nonprofit corporations. We look forward to working with you to achieve our vision of a nation in which veterans receive the finest care based on innovative research and education.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rusconi. Dr. Klotman, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. I really appreciate the opportunity to testify in front of you today. In addition to the Baylor College of Medicine, I also represent the Association of American Medical Colleges, which is a nonprofit organization comprised of all the U.S. medical schools and major teaching hospitals, including many of the VA hospitals. And I'd like to thank the full VA committee for preserving the VA's clinical relationship with academic medicine and the VA Mission Act to ensure our nation's veterans have access to clinical services at our institutions and receive the highest quality of health care. For this hearing, I will share information on the research enterprise and the VA academic relationship through my experience as a clinician and researcher. For you may not know this, but I began my career as a trainee clinician physician scientist at the VA. And I was also supported by the NIH. I was a staff physician at the Durham VA for 13 years while at the faculty at Duke Medical School. And both my wife and I are partially supported by Duke to work at the Durham VA. I have spent 17 years in civil service between my time at the VA and the NIH. And by the way, I'm the dean. My wife is also the dean of the Duke Medical School, and we all started our careers at the VA. The Michael DeBakey VA Medical Center in Houston was the first to affiliate with an academic partner and has been affiliated with Baylor since 1949. Today, it is one of the VA's largest hospitals, serving Harris County, Texas, and 27 surrounding counties. Baylor physicians provide virtually 100% of the medical care at the DeBakey VA. The veterans from around the country are referred there, and Baylor physicians provide the clinical services often not available by other providers. Same physicians at Baylor hospitals and the VA hospital. Medical schools fully integrate research and education with patient care, and these are very interdependent, as many of you physicians know. And to split those apart would really jeopardize the quality of care. Interestingly, the VA medical centers share the same tripartite mission of education, research, and clinical care. And by working together, we enhance the care for veterans and conduct research that provides new treatments and train the next generation of healthcare providers, many of whom are then attracted to have a career in the VA. Our clinical research partnership has led to tremendous care for our nation's veterans at the DeBakey VA. We have one of the 10 VA transaortic valve replacements programs. It is only one of 2 in the country with expertise in bronchial stenting for patients with lung cancer and fibrosis, and is one of the few that has a designated stroke center. The DeBakey VA is the hub of our VISN, but it also gets national referrals with complex cases, second opinions. We have people sent from all over the country to our VA. And we have launched centers of excellence in cancer and Parkinson's disease, post-traumatic stress disorder, liver transplant, epilepsy, substance abuse, and rehabilitation for mild to moderate traumatic brain injury. Our faculty are absolutely passionate about improving quality of care for the veterans, as well as our other affiliated hospitals. As national leaders, they can rapidly implement new guidelines and best practice initiatives for medical conditions in the care of our veterans. This partnership has played an important role in the DeBakey VA achieving a 4-star rating in just a 6-month period of time. Research leads to medical advances, and Baylor and the DeBakey VA have supported collaborations leading to innovation in mental health and cancer treatment, in prevention of antibiotic-resistant infections, in chronic obstructive lung disease and emphysema, as well as cardiac care. Nationally, most VA researchers have joint appointments at the VA and the affiliated medical school, which to physician scientists is viewed as a huge advantage, and it's a real important recruiting tool. At DeBakey, VA researchers have faculty appointment at Baylor, giving them access to all the resources at Baylor, including core laboratory facilities, oversight committees, dedicated IRB to the VA clinical trials, accreditation for human and animal research, and pre-award management for all non-VA grants. And these resources can be prohibitively expensive for VA medical centers and their not-for-profit corporations to support if they were independent of the affiliate. Sharing with academic affiliates reduces unnecessary redundancies and maximizes the use of federal dollars. Each VA academic partnership is unique. For example, about 20 years ago, Baylor and the DeBakey VA consulted with the VA, our non-for-profit corporation, and HHS, and agreed that we should be reimbursed by NIH grants for the on-campus facility, F&A. Baylor provides complete research oversight support and provides annual contributions to the non-for-profit corporation to support VA research, so money is flowing to the VA from us. All other medical schools, at other medical schools, NIH grants are administered by VA researchers vary based on the amount of infrastructure provided by the VA. Due to this variation in support that various VAs have for the research enterprise, the AAMC believes that administration of NIH grants should be determined at the local level by each VA medical center. A one-size-fits-all approach could hurt VA research programs as well as the collaborations with affiliates. The DeBakey VA relationship with Baylor and the joint appointment of researchers also is an important tool for recruiting physicians and scientists to the VA and retaining high-quality researchers. The VA affiliation also enhances the training quality of our programs, the Baylor programs. Our students and residents have the opportunity to work with veterans and learn about military health, which makes them better doctors. There are additional recommendations in the written testimony, but if I leave you with one message today, it is that without the synergistic 70-year partnership with academic medicine, the VA's ability to fulfill its mission of patient care, education, and research would be limited. I appreciate this opportunity again, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Klopman. Dr. Clancy, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Dunn, Chairman Bergman, Ranking Members Brownlee and Custer, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss VA's medical and prosthetic research program, and I'm accompanied by Dr. Rachel Ramoni, our Chief Research and Development Officer. VA's Office of Research and Development has been improving the lives of veterans through healthcare innovation and discovery for more than 90 years. And in so doing, civilians have also benefited from groundbreaking advances, including the first successful liver transplant, and as mentioned by the chairman, the pacemaker and the first shingles vaccine. We continue to conduct cutting-edge research, such as the development of a bionic ankle that helps propel users forward, the creation of the Million Veteran Precision Medicine Initiative, and groundbreaking work to repair severed spinal cords. In addition to the scientific merit of VA research, VA is also recognized for its ability to translate research findings into real-world benefits for our veterans. I want to thank the committee for the additional resources you provided in the omnibus. And in fact, we have created a one-page summary of how we will prioritize that unexpected but very welcome investment of resources, which I'd like to ask be entered into the record.
Without objection, it is entered.
The nonprofit research and education corporations, or NPCs, are an important part of the VA research partnership ecosystem. Established in 1988 to serve as a flexible vehicle to receive the external funds that help drive VA innovation. For example, a recently announced multi-million-dollar interagency agreement with the National Cancer Institute will be administered by the not-for-profit corporations. VA's affiliations with our nation's medical schools go back to 1946, when General Omar Bradley forged this pioneering partnership. 72 years later, we are affiliated with well over 90% of medical and osteopathic schools. So these partnerships give us access to cutting-edge technology, expertise, and national research networks that would be difficult, costly, and wasteful to duplicate within VA. For example, the spinal cord repair program previously mentioned is the product of a very strong collaboration with the University of California system. VA research is committed to supporting activities that improve the health and well-being of our veterans. Our Office of Research and Development evaluates proposed research projects by conducting rigorous scientific peer review. Projects that are not veteran-focused do not receive funding. In addition, our research portfolio is continually rebalanced over time to meet our veterans' most pressing needs. So today, our 5 clinical priorities are post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, suicide prevention, opioids, and Gulf War illness. While VA's medical and prosthetic research program focuses on benefiting current and future veterans, the output of our research ultimately benefits the nation. For example, in 2017, VA launched a nationwide study of the health benefits of a robotic exoskeleton for veterans with spinal cord injury. VA research also has an impressive track record of transforming VA healthcare by bringing new evidence-based treatments and technologies into everyday clinical care. 2 key examples recently. First is the implementation of a new suicide prevention clinical initiative. This has been diffused across our system based on predictive modeling and existing medical record data to identify veterans at the very highest risk of suicide so we can provide them with more intensive services and follow-up. Veterans are now using the bionic Luke arm as the result of our Office of Research's partnerships. The approval and delivery to veterans of the most advanced prosthetic arm ever created. This is an area, upper limb prostheses, that has not seen advances in about 50 years. VA's medical and prosthetic research program has significantly improved the care and well-being of our veterans. These gains have been possible because of consistent congressional commitment in both the form of attention and financial resources. And we believe it's critical to continue to move forward with the current momentum and preserve the gains made thus far. This concludes my testimony. My colleague and I are prepared to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clancy. We're going to go around the dais and have everybody 5 minutes to ask you questions. I'm going to ask the panel to try to answer concisely. I know that it's hard sometimes when we ask vague questions, but since we each only have 5 minutes, it's a plus if we can be concise. So I'm going to yield myself 5 minutes now and start with Dr. Clancy. A question. Given the prevalence of the PTSD and TBI among veterans, I'd like to know a little bit more about this. These are prioritized treatments you have and technologies. What can we offer our veterans that we hadn't been offering?
To some extent, we're looking at different and can offer now new medical treatments, and we're also looking at ways of how to deliver those treatments. For example, I'm going to guess that you're aware that 1/3 of the veterans we serve live in rural areas, so they've got a pretty substantial distance to travel to get care. And we have recently tested and developed a telehealth approach so that veterans can get this care virtually. And as nearly as we can tell from published studies, this is just as effective as traveling that distance and coming in person.
So you've got metrics on that?
Yes. Well,
we'd love to have you share that with us.
Sure.
Not right this minute, but that's something that would be of keen interest, I think, to everybody in this committee. Dr. Klopman, you mentioned not one size fits all, and one of the areas that we've had some interact with, which IRB do we use?
So it depends on what institution. In our case, we have 7 independent IRBs, but one of them is dedicated to the VA. So we can get very quick IRB approval for any clinical protocol.
Is the VA IRB quick for you? Is it easy to use?
It is, because it's run by Baylor.
Oh, okay.
So it's sort of outsourced to us, so we do it.
Do you think that translates across the country to all the research areas? Because we get the sense maybe it isn't.
I'd say one of the big problems when talking to academic institutions with their VA affiliate is getting clinical trials approved, and I think it's worth exploring how to improve the IRBs to facilitate clinical research for veterans. Absolutely important.
Okay, I'm going to, while I've got you there, Dr. Klopman, I'm going to ask you about translation of VA research to the bedside, so the clinical translation. Do you think that that's happening well? Do you think it's happening rapidly or enough?
I think it is happening terrifically well. We respond, scientists respond to funding opportunities. When you list 5 priorities, our scientists are focused on mental health, on opioid addiction, on PTSD, traumatic brain injury. We're trying to do AI around facial recognition to pick up depression by telemedicine. So we're very focused on trying to translate our work directly to patient care. But that's a mission, you look at the top 30 or 40 medical schools who are into research. We do translational research. That's what we're trying to do, and the VA does it very well.
So if I'm a medical student, I'm not going to go back to medical school. If I was a medical student,
I feel sorry for you.
You can have a syllabus for, and I think these 3 would fit, or top 4 priorities of your 5 would fit together very neatly: PTSD, TBI, suicide, and opioids. I mean, that sounds like one chapter. Get this and read it twice. Is that we have a syllabus for that?
Well, we don't have a syllabus per se, but we do encourage our students to do research with these investigators. We have a specialized center called iQuest, which is really around health and human services research. It's one of the biggest in the country. And we have 25 faculty and probably 40 trainees in that group, all doing research appropriate for veterans. It is actually funded by the VA and the NIH, and it's a tremendous center. So we have direct access for our trainees and learners to get into issues related to veterans.
Great. Dr. Clancy, so the same question on translation. Can you address that from your point of view, or maybe Dr. Ramoni, you choose?
Well, research that we publish and support is highly publicized within our own system. The next step is obviously to make sure that that is tightly linked with clinical operations, and I have to say that under Dr. Ramoni's leadership, there's been a much, much stronger partnership there between the research enterprise and the people who've got to worry every day about how to get this done. We literally had all of our network leaders in town this week, and to say, and Dr. Ramoni wasn't actually there for the conversation, but to say they were excited about research and to hear where they have taken money out of their own budgets to make sure that their veterans have access to the findings so that they can put them into practice was quite
I'm running short on time here, so I want to observe the limits so that I'll be a good role model here. Orion, Dr. Ramoni, are you using Orion for the total cancer care? Is that something that's?
We are not, We are not yet participating in Orion, and that is in part because Orion and Apollo, in which we are participating, both are seeking the same types of samples.
Okay, you and I are going to talk offline, and I recognize that my time has run out, and I will yield to Ms. Brownlee.
I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had just sort of a general overall question as it relates to the research that VA is undertaking. So where does one go to find out where all of the research, what are all of the research projects, across the country, and where is that happening? What are sort of the subject areas? Dr. Dunn just mentioned a couple in terms of opioid abuse or brain injuries, post-traumatic stress, et cetera. But I don't know kind of what's happening on a global sense in terms of the research.
It's a great question, and I'm so glad you asked. We put out a lot of information in the form of quarterly updates and newsletters, and I will tell you, if you run an organization, as I did for a number of years outside VA, that funds a lot of research, it is a bit challenging to figure out how do you put these into buckets together and in a way that's very, very accessible. I think we could do a better job. I think that in many ways, some of the phenomenal research we're funding has become one of the world's best kept secrets, and we're working very hard to try to overcome that. Do you want to add to that? We also have an external research advisory committee that meets 4 times a year, so they become a very important source of spreading our research, but we have a lot more to do.
Are they like an overseer, or?
They're an advisory group. I think it's fair to say that they do give a lot of advice, and one person's advice might feel like someone else's oversight, but 4 times a year I think is a pretty good rhythm, and they're pretty current on what's going on.
Hi, thank you for your question. I would just like to add that all of the research we fund is available through ERA Commons, which is NIH Reporter. So if you go to the NIH Reporter website and you select VA, you can get a list of all the projects we fund. Now, as Dr. Clancy said, I think we can do a better job of summarizing that, because I doubt with your busy schedules that you have time to scroll through our 2,000 funded projects. But what our National Research Advisory Committee has advised us is that we ought to, at least on a yearly basis, summarize the research impact so that we can share more broadly with others. And we do have a breakdown of where our funding is going in terms of types of research that we can certainly make available to you.
And is that found on a website somewhere as well, in terms of the priorities and the amount of resources funding those priorities?
We can certainly direct you to those. I am not certain if they're listed on the website, because as Dr. Clancy said, it can sometimes be a challenge to clearly convey the distinct categories. For instance, if you were looking at suicide risk amongst people with opioid substance use disorder, they'd be classified under 2 sections. And so that's sometimes a challenge for us to present, but we'd be happy to walk you through that orally as well in a briefing.
Just as a layperson looking into this, it seems it just seems very complicated and complex in trying to pull the layers apart to kind of see what's there. And once you start doing that, it tends to get more confusing, to me anyway, and more complicated, as opposed to sort of understanding what are the broad strokes, and are we all in agreement in terms of what our priorities are and the areas in which we want to continue to explore. And so anyway, just as a general statement, I think for a layperson and for people to understand that we are actually doing research and pursuing innovations when we really can't translate that to the public and to the community, so that people know that their tax dollars are going to a good purpose, and that we do want to resolve and solve some of these issues that particularly veterans are experiencing when they come home from the battlefield. So
I'm going to take that as a charge that we need a greatest hits, to use an old analogy. No, but I mean, I'm saying that with the utmost respect. It takes some thought and so forth to do that, but we should. And
very good. I see my time is out, so I will yield back.
Thank you, Representative Brownlee. And since you yield back 10 seconds, I'm going to say we would all like to see that list of, sort of not all 2,000, but how you're prioritizing, where the resources are going, and sort of by subject matter what they are. So thank you very much for that. We'll now recognize Mr. Poliquin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Thank you all very much. It's so important to make sure that our research goes on with our affiliates, our academic affiliates, in concert with VA, to make sure that we do the best we can for our veterans. We owe them that responsibility to do that. Mr. Klopman, I want to ask you a question. You mentioned a minute ago some of your research dealt with diabetes and what have you. Why wouldn't the VA, why wouldn't all the research on behalf of our veterans focus on ailments and maladies that are specific to veterans, like PTSD and traumatic brain injury and exposure to toxins and so forth and so on? If you have all these other institutions around the country doing great work on cancer and diabetes, why would we spend taxpayer dollars to do that? We can get that already.
So I think that you have to look at the broad health of veterans throughout their entire lifespan. Yet there are things that are very specific to veterans, but there are also things that impact veterans' lives. If you look at, you know, the vast number of veterans that we're taking care of, their day-to-day problems are often common illnesses.
You know, and we have research on most of those common ailments, don't we?
Breakthroughs come from all different places. It's really hard to, you know, to say, well, we're going to have a cure for diabetes that's NIH focused. Mm-hmm.
So we might be spending taxpayer dollars working on diabetes for veterans, where we're doing it at other research facilities around the country. And you don't think that's duplicative and wasteful?
No, I actually don't. I will tell you that the vast majority of research that we do at the VA is very specific to veterans' problems. Mm-hmm. But the
veterans, thank you, sir.
Let me just say one thing, though. If you're taking care of a veteran for their entire lifespan and you're trying to have them have good outcomes, you have to take care of all of their illnesses.
No, of course not. I'm not talking about specific to a veteran. I'm saying a malady that's specific to the veteran population. That's what I'm referring to. Dr. Clancy, the VBA, the Veterans Benefit Administration, collects mountains of data on the 7 million veterans we take care of now. Do we aggregate this data and white out, of course, who the individuals are, but aggregate this data such that we can use it to determine where the research should go?
We have some people who are beginning to take a very hard look at that. I guess
do we aggregate the data, and do we use it to make decisions on where the research dollars should go for our veterans? Because anybody that collects that amount of data on the veterans certainly know what their problems are.
Yes, and we're certainly aware of where the greatest opportunities are in terms of where people apply for benefits.
So who is aggregating that data?
We can take that for the record, and I'll follow up. It is not a routine function that feeds right into research priorities, but which is what I think you're
if we're looking for research on veterans who have problems, and we have mountains of data on what their ailments are, it would make sense to me that we use that information. So our office will get back to you to see what a more complete answer would be, if that's okay.
Yes, that would be
fine. Today, Mr. Chairman, there's about $600 million in the VA budget that is specifically earmarked for medical research that's conducted either at the VA medical facilities around the country, about 160 of them. But there's an additional $1.2 billion each year, roughly, for veterans, for research for veteran health. And it comes mostly from the NIH and the Department of Defense, and they're issued by grants. This research is either conducted at the VA or at medical institutions, affiliates, academic institutions, universities like Baylor, great universities like Baylor across the country. Now, there are, if I understand this correctly, and Ms. Rasconi, you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure, there are roughly 150 individuals across the country that make decisions where the administration of those research projects go, either through you folks, through the NPCs, or they're administered actually through the research organizations themselves. I think they're called investigators, and I think, Ms. Ramoni, you came to us several months ago, and you used to be an investigator, and Mr. Klopman, you might be one now, I don't know. But my point being this: if an investigator is an employee of the VA, and also an employee of, say, Harvard, my alma mater, so I'm not picking on Baylor, and they all of a sudden are an individual, he or she, whose career is dependent upon how much taxpayer dollars they can come to that institution, whether it be Baylor or Harvard or Yale or Stanford, wherever it might be. But they're also in a position to determine who gets the administration dollars for that project. Now, up in Maine, where I come from, that's a conflict of interest. And here's why that matters. Let's say you have a $10 million grant from the NIH. The administration cost is an add-on to that grant. Now, if I'm not mistaken, over at the NPCs that were formed 30 years ago specifically for this reason, your add-on cost is roughly 25, 26%. So that's $2.5 million on a $10 million grant to develop whatever it might be, a new prosthetic. However, at places like Harvard, my understanding is that the add-on cost is roughly 70%.
Mr. Pelican,
Yes,
your
sir.
time is expired, but I like your line of questioning. I encourage you to pursue that.
Great. Would you like to, or anybody else like to give their time to me, Mr. Chairman?
I'll give them their opportunity when your time comes. All right? All right, so that'll be the next.
Thank you, sir.
Representative Custer.
Thank you very
Your
much,
5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being with us. I want to also thank you for mentioning the Luke arm in your testimony, Dr. Clancy. We're very proud in New Hampshire of the development of the Luke arm, and I've had the chance to see it in action, and it's really very impressive. I wanted to hone in on the conversation about our chair today has mentioned PTSD, traumatic brain injury, opioid addiction. I'm the chair of a bipartisan task force in Congress. We now have 105 members working together, Republicans and Democrats, on legislation to combat the opioid epidemic. And I know that there is research being conducted. Congresswoman Brownlee referenced a study out of Minnesota. It would be very helpful for us, and I'd even like to ask our chairs of the Health Committee and the subcommittee and the Oversight Subcommittee if we could put together a session that I'd be happy to organize with members from the task force to talk about lessons that can be learned to reduce the use of opioid medication. But in that regard, can you talk a little bit more about how this research is getting from the lab to use across the VA, and then what we would like to do, I'm working on legislation about a center of excellence so that we can then take those lessons learned into the civilian population.
So it's a great question, and frankly, we use any vehicle that we can. So for example, in terms of treating chronic pain and the use of opioids, we have an evidence-based guideline that we develop in collaboration with the Department of Defense because it speaks to the unique injuries and experiences of active duty members and as well as veterans. So that becomes one, because those guidelines are updated almost continuously to make sure that they have all the current evidence, that becomes one great vehicle to incorporate our latest research. I think that your idea of having such a session would be phenomenal because there's a lot going on in 3 areas. One is what other alternatives do we have to opioids? Mm-hmm. A second is what non-pharmacologic in terms of chronic pain management, which the whole country is struggling for and a bigger problem for our veterans. And the third is how do we help people who are addicted actually begin to return to a functional life?
And if I could just add to the list, a fourth would be the CDC has recognized that 4 out of 5 heroin users have co-occurring mental health issues.
Yes.
And I think the veteran population with the anxiety, depression, traumatic brain injury, we're finding in the civilian population trauma, for example, sexual assault, domestic violence trauma. So I think there's a lot to be learned, and you can tell from 105 members of Congress coming and working together right now, this is very rare, and you can tell the urgency and the breadth of this problem across the country. So I'd love to work with you on that. I guess my other question, I'm very familiar, Dartmouth Medical School is my district. I work a lot with them. And they are the academic affiliate for White River Junction VA, and we're working on an affiliation, hopefully, with our Manchester VA that's had some troubles. I'm familiar in the private sector, in the civilian world, that we have, for example, the New England Journal of Medicine, that physicians can stay current on research that's published. Is there a corollary from VA research where physicians can stay current based upon research results that are published?
So we have a terrific dissemination center that's part of the Office of Research and Development, and They will routinely put out surveys of research, which is, not surveys, I'm sorry, summaries of research that's just been published and so forth, which is extremely helpful. They'll usually give you the electronic link. So if the journal makes it free access, right then you've got it. And I was literally looking at one on the way over here. Some of our work is also going to get into something at NIH called Medline Plus, which actually translates into something closer to plain language English. I don't want to overstate this, sort of abstracts of published studies and so forth. Whether we can and should do more, we share a lot of cutting-edge findings with our veteran service organizations and so forth, but I'm sure that there's more that we could do.
So my time is up, but I think I would join my colleagues in saying that we would be very interested in accessing those preferably plain English versions to understand, so that we can share with the taxpayers the incredible advances that are coming out of the VA. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Custer. Representative Higgins, we recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield a minute of my time to my colleague, Mr. Poliquin.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. Thank you, Mr. Higgins, very much. I appreciate it. We've already determined that at the NPCs, the add-on cost for administration is roughly 25, 26%. Mr. Klopman, what's the add-on cost at Baylor? Say it again, sir?
56.5 cents.
56.5. Ms. Rusconi, what's the difference between the administrative functions you provide for research done at the VA and the administrative functions that the folks at Baylor do, or at Harvard or Yale or anybody else? Is the service essentially the same? Does it include doing the paperwork and paying the bills and ordering supplies? Do I have that right?
For the most part, I would agree. At our VA actually takes care of all of the IRB and all of the services that were described.
Thank you. Mr. Klopman, who determines whether it's 56% or 70%?
The HHS comes and does a very complete audit. It's like having...
So it's NIH, whoever awards the grant, they determine what you're going to get paid?
We negotiate with them every 3 years, and we show our costs. I mean, it's a very rigorously reviewed, the cost of oversight of research. Mm-hmm. The differences are often what services you're providing. So we provide IACUC, IRB, all those are real costs.
Mr. Rusconi, do you provide the same services they do at the academic affiliates?
Actually, at the Kansas City VA, we provide the IACUC, the IRB, and the R&D for our facility, as well as the facility in Wichita, Kansas, and we provide the IRB.
Thank you. We're stewards of the taxpayer dollars. We're $21 trillion in debt. The interest payments on that debt are about $240 billion a year. That exceeds our entire budget by the VA by about 40%. Every dollar counts. What I'm trying to determine is we've got two folks.
Captain Higgins, will you yield another minute to Mr.
Poliquin? I'm trying to figure out why. Sorry, Clay. Thank you, Clay.
One more minute.
I would just say that you should look at the services provided. I mean, this is a real menu of costs. These are not fictitious costs. They're real overhead. Just the same way you come to this building.
And whoever issues the grant, NIH, DOD, they determine what your costs will be in negotiation with you, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And the grants, a point you made before about it's the individual and the conflict of interest, the grants are administered to the institution, not to the individual.
No, but the individual who's the investigator at the institution can also award the administration to you. Is that correct?
Well, that's not really accurate. For NIH, the grant is awarded to the institution in behalf of the individual. The expectation is that the institution supervises and oversees the research, and that the spending is responsible.
And who determines where that administrative dollars go? Does the NIH or does the investigator?
The NIH determines where it goes. It's not the individual investigator. With an individual,
that's not what Dr. Clancy and Dr.
No, if there's an individual who has shared time, every 2 weeks they have to fill out their activities report, and if the amount of time that is covered at the VA is covered by the VA, and the amount of time that's covered by the NIH is covered by the NIH. There's no overlap of the two.
Okay, so you don't think it's a conflict?
One moment, Mr. Poliquin. Representative Higgins, you have 3 minutes remaining. Do you? Then you're recognized for 3 minutes, Representative Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and God bless you, my colleague, Bruce. Dr. Clancy, you may recall, Madam, we met in my office and we briefly discussed the inclusion of urgent care facilities as a means by which veterans could access care in their community. The VA Mission Act passed the House of Representatives yesterday. If signed into law, will this provision and the precedent set by the recent launch of urgent care access for veterans in Southern California, will that provide the VA adequate authority to expand access to these walk-in urgent care facilities in other regions? I've been advised that it would. Thank you for that
Yes.
answer. My larger question to you, Dr. Klopman, you mentioned some of the research being telemedicine using facial recognition for depression. I have an overall concern about a culture of overprescription of pharmaceuticals for our veterans, opioids, antidepressants, and we're investing money that's been harvested from the people to pay for research, and I'm a big supporter of telemedicine. I think it's wonderful. I have large rural communities in my district. But facial recognition for depression, how would that determine the difference between temporary depression or normal moments of sadness or reflection, a contemplative, somber moment? How would that differentiate from the diagnosis of clinical depression, which could lead to further overprescription of pharmaceuticals into our veterans population? I'm very concerned about the culture we've created within our veteran populations. That our goal should be to get them back into a state of productive participation in society, and yet we're building barriers for them to return to work and return to society as a productive citizen because of the pharmaceuticals that we prescribe.
Well, I think you've hit upon a national problem. You're absolutely right. The study that's currently ongoing is to do exactly what you said. Can you sort out situational mood?
Are we working on non-medicinal treatment research for PTSD, for instance?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Service dogs,
and the other thing is
group therapy, et cetera.
And it's hard for veterans sometimes to come to the VA. The whole purpose of this is getting more continuous follow-up so you can detect problems sooner. I mean, the idea is to improve their lives and in ways that are not drug dependent. Absolutely.
Thank you for your answer. And I would also like a response, perhaps in writing, from my colleague brought up, Mr. Chairman, regarding where exactly can we observe what research is taking place across the country and what the nature of that research is. I yield back.
Your question is noted, Representative Higgins. Representative Lamb, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Clancy, by way of greatest hits, I just wanted to note back in Pittsburgh, in a VA that is not actually in my district, but it is near it, and it takes care of many of veterans from our district, we had the development of a pneumatic wheelchair powered by an air motor. Dr. Rory Cooper, we're very proud of that. The chair only weighs 80 pounds. And it can be used, it's waterproof basically, so one of the things that they've used it for is kids with disabilities go to water parks, and they use it, veterans as well. So that was a great achievement by our VA research in Pittsburgh at the Human Engineering Research Lab. So I think that's a good one to highlight. It's made a big difference in people's lives. It's easier for family members to carry it around because it's so light. One concern that I have heard expressed from folks back in Pittsburgh is that in the Office of Research and Development, there tends to be a lot of resources behind the research side of it and less behind the development side of it. So I'll just throw it open, maybe either Dr. Clancy or Dr. Ramoni. Have you heard that concern before from people within the system?
Thank you, Congressman Lamb. That is, as you heard, one of my 3 priorities is to increase the real-world impact of VA research. And in fact, in collaboration with Dr. Rory Cooper's lab in Pittsburgh, and I had the pleasure of visiting it and using that pneumatic wheelchair, which is really a remarkable invention. we are establishing a development pipeline with him. Often, the first step is producing enough of a thing such that you can get buy-in to produce it more broadly. For instance, to have enough versions of that pneumatic wheelchair such that a company might want to pick it up and produce it and distribute it. So we are entering currently in a partnership with Dr. Cooper's lab in order to do that. In addition, we are taking a number of other steps to ensure that we move from bench or lab to bedside more quickly. We are in the basic science space funding actual development dollars to conduct toxicology studies, which are the gap between the bench research and moving into clinical trials. So we have a broad-based effort to take more of our in-lab developed innovations and move them out where veterans can benefit from them.
What is kind of the number one thing that we can do to support that, to make it easier? Well,
it's certainly companies. I would say one of our great challenges is that sometimes veterans have very specialized needs. And so, for instance, in upper limb prostheses, some companies might not find it financially attractive to proceed in those spaces. And so any help that, frankly, any party can provide to us in helping to overcome that barrier would be wonderful. As an alternative, we are looking at, in those cases, could we, as a department, and obviously this would be outside of research and development, could we actually produce those items for our veterans if no for-profit company is willing to step into that space?
Are there, in addition to just overall more funding for research, are there specific programs that could use a shot in the arm to improve that transition that you're talking about?
So in technology transfer, and of course people know a GAO report came out recently, and that's an area of intense focus for us. We are doing a fantastic job on getting invention disclosures. The machinery to then actually market those inventions to producers is something that we are building. And so that area in particular will help us go from invention to actual real-world use by veterans.
Great. And I yield back the remainder of my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lamb. Mr. Arrington, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow along the line of my colleague, Mr. Lamb. I was former Vice Chancellor for Research and Technology Commercialization at Texas Tech, believe it or not. And it's complicated and it's challenging to get a early stage technology to market. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of capital, it takes an entrepreneurial team. Not many universities are culturally aligned with the sort of entrepreneurial dynamics that exist in the marketplace. So you got to really wire it well. There's some sophisticated ecosystems in Stanford and Boston and some other places, but it's very, very difficult. My take on this is get it out. Get it out of the VA for God's sake. And I'm just saying that because it's a big bureaucracy. And it is not entrepreneurial or innovative, but there could be some great discoveries. I think, relatively speaking, universities don't have that very well. The best way to commercialize it is get it to a startup company, get it to an established industry partner, and let them run with it and make sure that we take a piece of the action to evergreen the research. Well, speaking of that, what are the deals that we make? How many, you said disclosures have increased. So what about revenue from, what about license agreements? Are they going up or down? Sorry, you,
Rachel.
Mrs. Ramon.
Yes. So thank you for your question. It's an area that's of very high interest to me, not only for the revenues, but also because this means that these products are out there where veterans can benefit.
Exactly.
And,
but if there's no financial motive, they won't do it. Just let's be clear.
Absolutely.
So how many license agreements, are they going up or down? Or
they are
flat?
going up, and I have the facts and figures in here, but I can tell you in terms of royalties, and if you read the GAO report, it's a pretty stark description of where we are now, or where we were. Back in 2016, we just had $300,000 in royalties, and I have to say, historically, that
300, how much?
$1,000 in royalties.
That's it?
Yes, and that's why I'm saying it's a pretty stark.
How many annual disclosures do you get of
we get
potential IP, potential marketable products?
Over 500 disclosures.
Over 500.
That's right.
300. So I'd say that is.
Yes, and I do want to add that.
How long have you been in this space of technology transfer within the VA?
Well, I've just been.
Not you personally, the VA in general.
So the VA, I think certainly the attention that the VA received from the House Veterans Affairs Committee surrounding the Shanazi hepatitis C treatment brought greater attention, and we are grateful for Mr. Bergman having written to the Secretary to increase our number of staff in tech transfer. So it has been a relatively recent growth in our tech transfer team, and we got a new head of tech transfer.
I'd outsource it. I'd give it to a group that does that. That's their core competency. They do that for a living. They have the connections with the money guys. They have the connections with the industry. They move at the speed of business. I just would do it. I mean, I must say, 500 disclosures and $300,000 in revenue is paltry. I'm not blaming you. I just don't think it's aligned with the core mission. We have got to have incentives to get this IP into the right hands where they can raise the capital, take it to market, and make a difference. They'll never make a difference, in my opinion, inside the VA culture. It's not wired for that, and it's not an indictment on your skills and competency. It's just a cultural reality. What is the definition? Let me just jump to Clancy for Dr. Clancy. How do you measure success? And I'm not trying to be rude. It's time. We don't have a lot of time. So how do you measure success among the researchers that you give taxpayer money to discover?
Sure. So broadly, that would be publications, of course. It would be who else or what other entities have picked up those publications. So, for example, if work published becomes part of a Medicare quality measure, that's going to have a big impact.
Does transferring the technology to commercializing the technology, is that a metric?
That has to be a metric.
Is it a metric of success? Do you hold people accountable for that?
Do we hold them accountable? Not yet. I want to be clear. Under Rachel's leadership, just in the past 2 years, we're on an upward curve for sure. I would love to have the opportunity to follow up with you, your staff, about what might be some options for who else we could partner with to make this happen. Some parts of the government have small business innovation research and a variety of mechanisms that we actually do not have. But that's just one that occurs to the top of my brain. I'm sure there's a variety of other mechanisms, and given your experience, I think it would be a great topic
I'd love to sit down with
on.
you. I want it to be successful, and I'm over my time. If you have a second round, I'm going to stick around.
To that point, we will have time for a second round. I encourage you to stick around and take advantage of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry to abuse my
But
time
I will recognize now for 5 minutes Representative Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Vietnam Veterans of America Statement, for the record, raised an issue about limited VA-funded research for certain health conditions that are of immediate consequence to veterans, citing the long-term effects of Agent Orange exposure as an example that remains significant for Vietnam War veterans, and conditions stemming from military exposure, such as toxic substances from burn pits for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. This point relates to an issue that's been raised by veterans in my district in New York on Long Island regarding exposure to liver fluke in Vietnam, which is a parasite prevalent in Southeast Asia known to cause a certain type of cancer that can take literally decades for, I mean, I'm telling you, you guys know this, for symptoms to appear. The VAMC in Northport, which is further out on Long Island, conducted the first ever pilot study on liver fluke in Vietnam vets through a partnership with an academic medical center in South Korea, which was privately funded after the VA declined to fund the study. For veterans who are just starting to show the long-term effects of something that they were exposed to in Vietnam, this type of health condition obviously is of immediate concern. So to any of the panel members, this concern that the VA is not funding research for certain health issues that are of immediate consequence to veterans. And now, while I may admit that the effects of liver fluke might relate to a small population of veterans, they still serve this country and are suffering this condition because of their service. So if anyone can answer that question as to why the VA is not funding research for certain health issues that are right now, and for that matter, the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans that are of immediate consequence to veterans.
Well, thanks to your support, that is, of the Congress, right? We are funding a burn pits registry, and I've been really seriously impressed by the enthusiastic response from veterans in terms of their enrolling in this. And one of Dr. Ramoni's 5 priority areas for the additional support we got through the omnibus is actually to focus on exposure to Agent Orange and the impacts among Blue Water Navy veterans. The liver fluke issue is quite interesting. I would say it's fair to say that one can find lots of examples, not just at VA, but elsewhere, where somebody turned down a very novel kind of research project at one point in time, or something that over time turned out to be very, very consequential. The word is out among veterans. One of the challenges we have is that we do not, at this moment in time, as I understand it, have a commercially available test to be able to test for that. So many veterans are coming in to see their docs saying, I want this test because I read about this research. So we need to find out more about that, and we'd be happy to follow up with you.
Well, thank you. I would ask.
And I know that Rick is very interested.
Yes, thank you. Final question, and then I'll give whatever time I have to Mr. Poliquin if he wants it. What steps can the VA take to standardize and eliminate delays associated with the ISO reviews to advance clinical trials and support successful research partnerships?
ISO rules, yeah.
Thank you for your question. As you might have heard, we held a summit on April 12th with a broad variety of stakeholders to look at all the barriers that prevent us from starting up clinical trials, especially industry trials, efficiently. One of those was the Information Security Officer Review, and I'm very happy and proud to say that we now have 3 research-specific information security officers in place, and I've been receiving emails from the field that say that this transforms everything, and this, when we announced it at the summit, received a standing ovation. So we're pleased to have addressed that.
Great, that's great news. And I have 51 seconds for my friend, Mr. Poliquin, with the chairman's approval.
You're recognized for 46 seconds.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I have in front of me the May report of the Inspector General at HHS. Let me read this to you, if I may. Department of Health and Human Services, which is the parent organization for the National Institute of Health, and under that is a Division of Financial Advisory Services, DFAS, is the federal agency responsible for negotiating and establishing indirect costs rates, i.e. administrative rates, for nonprofit organizations, our affiliates, academic affiliates, that receive the majority of the federal awards from HHS. In their conclusion, in part, DFAS did not always comply with federal requirements for establishing indirect cost rates. So I am very suspect that the process that is used to determine the rates between our affiliates and the federal government is up to snuff. But with that, thank you very much, Congressman Rice. I know we're going to have a second round, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Chairman.
There will be a second round.
Thank you.
I now recognize General Bergman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we're overloaded with acronyms around here, but I'd like to give you a new one. RTR, Research to Results. So having said that, as you look at where you are, because I see a lot of familiar faces at the testimony table, and you see at the front end of the food chain with those doing the research, we see you all the time. Why don't we see them? That's okay. It's a rhetorical question, I can tell. Stunned. No, the point is, we've all played the game where you start the message around the room, and by the time it gets back, and this committee, you know, bipartisan, we want to get to the bottom line very quickly. Not that they have to come here and testify, but I would suggest to you that most of the committee members here would be more than willing to devote some time to walk right into a research lab because of the fact that we get to talk with the people right then, right there. So when front end, those literally in the labs doing the research, to this end where we're doing, you know, the testimony, if you will, as far as the results. Again, I'll just speak for myself. I like to see the amount of layers that this goes through and where it gets scrubbed, where it gets, you know, redirected. So the point is, we can do better. Dr. Clancy, do you think the VA, NIH, and possibly DOD are duplicating research?
Having run a research agency for a number of years for HHS, I can assure you that a very key part of all application submissions is saying where else that you're funded. And if you are untruthful about that, that's fraud and a reason to withdraw support. So by and large, and we have people that check that all the time. So I don't think that they are duplicating research. What I worry about more is gaps. And that's where we have been reaching out recently far more to the NIH, to defense, and so forth, to figure out, okay, here's all this great stuff.
So the point is, you know, so the point is, if we were to say, okay, can you give us an example over the last 4 or 5 years of where this review board or whoever the folks were, you could produce a list of said, okay, you know, Houston and New York are doing this overlap, and we said no to one of them. I mean, is there some kind of data that we could get?
In general, that's almost always going to be handled before it even gets to peer review by a scientific committee. If it doesn't get handled then, it's going to get handled before.
Are there records? I mean, if the peer, I mean, the bottom line is when someone sitting at a desk is asked to look at a couple of different proposals and says, no, we're already doing it here, is there data that we can pull up that says that?
If it looks like, I can't speak for NIH, but could find out for you, and I don't know if we have that kind of record. I know that in general, we feel like their opportunities greatly exceed available resources, which is not intended to sound ungrateful, but it also means that...
Well, but that's more of a reason.
Exactly.
Because if you have more opportunities than you do have resources, we have to ensure everything we do does not accidentally overlap something that is already being done, because we're dealing with finite resources here that we have to focus on that research that is going to directly benefit our veterans in the long term. I'd like to just for a second here to expand on Mr. Poliquin's line of questioning. You know, Dr. Clancy, in many instances, it is a researcher who decides which entity, the VA or the affiliate, will administer the NIH or DOD grants. Do you think allowing the researcher to make the decision creates a conflict of interest? And if so, what can the VA do to eliminate that?
I think that it may be perceived as a conflict of interest, which the distinction between those two, I think, is negligible.
A lot of cases, they have dual appointments. Do you think there's any pressure being put on in some cases because you have a dual appointment? You're basically working very hard, but you can only serve one master, but you might be serving two?
Whether people perceive that there is implicit pressure, for example, in the form of promotions and tenure and things like that, I can't say. I think the study we're doing now will shed some light on that in terms of how those decisions are made.
When do you think that study will be done?
Rachel, when will the WestStat study be done?
The WestStat study will be complete by the end of September, sir.
Great, I look forward to that. And I'm going to give you back 10 seconds, Chairman.
Thank you very much, General Bergman. So we finished the first round of questions. We're blessed to have some time left on the clock. I'd like to go back around and allow additional questions. And clearly they're passionate and interested people here on the dais. Representative Brownley, recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Clancy, I wanted to ask you a question. Congress authorized 2 major medical leases at Hines and Albuquerque focused on research activities. To date, neither lease appears to have been executed by the department, and in fact, VA has told stakeholders that it is engaged in procuring a contract to re-examine the requirements for the Hines location. This is concerning because Hines researchers are located, my understanding, in a century-old building. Additionally, in this year's President's budget submission, VA removed a request for a lease for a research facility in San Francisco. I'm concerned that VA is not taking action to ensure that VA researchers and partners have access to modern facilities to conduct research, which we know is a major plus in VA for recruiting clinicians. Can you tell me what the status of the 3 leases and what assistance you might need from Congress to move forward on these leases for which you clearly identified a need as recently as a year ago?
I will take that for the record and get back to you promptly. I don't know the status of the current leases. I do know that the San Francisco VA is now engaged in a partnership to move major chunks of their facility, so I can imagine that might have led to a delay or pause in the additional research space, but for Hines and Albuquerque, I do not know. I do know, to Mr. Poliquin and the Chairman Bergman's questions, that some of the issues around space and available research space have something to do, I believe, with where the indirect costs are actually administered on occasion. But we will get
If you could get back to me on that, I would appreciate it very much. And Dr. Klopman, in your testimony, you said to duplicate services such as numerous oversight and review services, if NIH grants were to instead be managed by the MPC, would produce no additional value and be a wasteful use of tax dollars. Can you expound on that?
Well, I think it depends. Again, each institution's a little bit different. We do, in part because we have this long relationship with the VA dating back to the mid-40s. A lot of the research infrastructure was generated on the Baylor College of Medicine side. If for some reason now it was, well, let's have it all administered by the not-for-profit entity, they would have to duplicate a lot of the things that we're doing. They'd have to, the oversight committees, the IRB, everything, including bringing on and recruiting faculty and educating them as to ethical conduct of research. There's just a lot of infrastructure that would have to be duplicated to do that, and that's why I think it is it's duplicative in our case, but not in all cases, but in our case.
Ms. Rascani, would you like to comment?
Yes, I would really like to respond to that. I applaud what they have going on down at Baylor, and we absolutely would not ever want to upset a system that, from all appearances, is working very, very well, both for the VA, the nonprofit, and for the affiliate. There is no reason to change that. But there are many, many other situations throughout the country where that is not happening, and that is part of our concern. There are also other models besides what is happening at Baylor, like in California, where some of those services are split between the VA and the affiliate, and also where there's a different format for the submission of grants. If the predominance of the work is occurring at the VA, then the nonprofit takes the lead. If the predominance of the work is taking place at the affiliate, then the affiliate takes the lead. And that has worked out very well. And honestly, the most profitable, for the most part, the most profitable NPCs are actually on the West Coast, and they benefit greatly from that, and their VAs benefit greatly from that. For instance, they get infrastructure and many other things like buildings and all those other pieces that the nonprofit can contribute to that VA.
Thank you for that, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Brownlee. Representative Poliquin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rasconi, if the NPC in your case is awarded the administrative work for research done at the VA, if you don't use all those dollars in the administration of that project, does that go back to the VA?
I don't think I understand the question.
If in the administration of the project or the project itself, the research project itself, if all the funds are not consumed for that project, where does the money go?
If it's a federal project, the way that it's done is the administrative body, whoever it is, whether it would be the affiliate or the MPC, they have to expend those costs first before they get reimbursed. And so we would not be able to draw down those funds. So
So it stays in the VA.
Well, it doesn't go to the VA. It would never leave the NIH. So if we had a researcher that had a $50,000 grant,
Okay.
That's what would happen. But if
Thank you. Dr. Clancy, and don't want to be rude, Ms. Visconti, we just have a limited amount of time. Dr. Clancy, if Harvard, to pick on Harvard a little bit, my alma mater, they're a great school. If they win they apply for and receive a $10 million grant from the NIH, they receive the money, they're doing the research, and they don't. And also, the investigator is working with the VA and for Harvard, so the investigator says, no, we're going to do the administration also, which I think is an inherent conflict of interest we've already discussed, is that and that's in their markup, I guess, is 70%. So you're talking about $10 million for the research, $77 million for the add-on, administrative add-on. If that money in either case is not used, does Harvard keep it? If the research project ends without spending the $10 million, do they keep it, or they return it to the VA or to the NIH?
They do not keep it.
Where does it go?
I don't believe they return it.
They just don't draw it down. Is that correct?
They do not draw it down,
Got it.
Mr. Poliquin.
Thank you very much.
I would like to point out that the off-site rate, so if the work were being done at the VA but run through Harvard, the off-site rate for that typically is around 20%, 25%, so pretty close to that of the
Mr. Rusconi?
my question, when they're talking about the off-site rate for the affiliate, is if that work is happening at the VA, why would they be getting an indirect rate at that point? Because honestly, at that point, if the work is happening at the VA, there should be a subaward to the NPC.
You know what I'd like to see? And I'm going to, we have subpoena power here, don't we, Mr. Chairman? We have subpoena power here, don't we? Yeah, great. Okay, here's what I'd like to see. It's going to be very simple, and I think I asked for it last time Dr. Clancy and Dr. Ramoni were here. It's very simple. What I'd like to see is going back, take 5 years. We could probably go back 50, but let's take 5 years. What I'd like to see is every grant that was awarded by the VA, by the NIH, by the DOD, and any other large organizations that do this outside the VA. I think it's the NIH and DOD. Every grant, what it was used for, who it went to, what the amount was for, who did the administrative work, and what that amounted to. That would be really telltale, so we can see and so we can determine what the rate is, so we can see where the taxpayer dollars are going. This is supposed to be used for care of veterans. I'm all for research. I love it. I want to make sure the taxpayers aren't getting ripped off, and I want to make sure that our veterans get maximum bang for their buck. And when you have a delta between 25% and 56% or 70%, which is what was told last July, if I understand this correctly, then something's wrong. I'm missing something. And so I want to get that data. Dr. Clancy, how do we get that data?
We will take a first crack at assembling it for you.
No, we already have a study that we started back in July or September, whatever it was, or 6 or 9 months in. It will be a year before we get the study. Is it going to have this data?
Rachel.
Mr. Poliquin, thank you for your question. As we discussed, both when you were kind enough to visit us as well as with your staff.
Well, not only visit you, I paid an unannounced house call because you folks weren't responsive to our staff in getting the data. So it wasn't a scheduled visit. I just showed up.
We appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate getting us this data. How do we get this data?
We explained to you at that point that that data currently is not in the VA's hands, that we had made efforts.
So how do we get this data?
The NIH would have to cooperate with us in releasing those data, which would require a congressional request.
Okay, good. And that data can be released directly, I think, Mr. Bergman, can it, to this committee? Thank you very much. Yield back my time. I don't have any.
Thank you, Representative Poliquin. Representative Custer,
Just a quick question, if I could. This is for Dr. Ramoni. We've been talking about bridging the gap between basic research and clinical research, and my particular interest is brain health diagnostics. The director of National Institute of Mental Health in 2013 stated we must set our sights higher than a 19th century approach for mental health diagnosis. So physicians need more than the current symptom-based categories. Symptoms alone rarely indicate the best choice of treatment. My question to you is, can the VA support biomarker discovery and validation and pursue the deployment of at least 2 additional brain health diagnostic measurements, before 2023. And if anyone else has any comment on that, I'm happy to hear.
Thank you for that question. As you heard, several of my priorities touch on mental health with PTSD, suicide prevention, TBI, opioid use disorder, and it is a high priority of ours to move from symptom-based diagnostics to biomarker-based diagnostics. Even our work in Gulf War illness, we're moving towards biomarker-based diagnostics. To that end, we are developing roadmaps for a set of projects that are intended to lead to objective biomarker diagnostics for both PTSD and TBI. And we are not doing this alone. We are working in collaboration with NIH, with DOD, and with Cohen Veterans Bioscience and industry partners in order that this should move forward as quickly as possible.
Great. Thank you very much, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Kuster. Representative Arrington, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, believe in research and the investment we make as a federal government to discover, to solve problems, and I think that no place on planet Earth do we do that better than in the United States of America. And I think a part of that is the investment the federal government makes. But we've got to do it in a smart way, in a strategic way, in a cost-effective way. We have to know what our core competencies are and what we are not as competent in, where there's greater expertise in the marketplace. So I think my colleague, Mr. Poliquin, I appreciate his passion for making sure this is working the way it's supposed to. And we have an oversight role, obviously, in that. And I guess my first question is, what is the process by which we engage in the research agenda? When you set that agenda, and there have been questions about how do we prevent mission creep, how do we focus on our area of interest and impact, which is those things that affect the unique community of our veterans, as opposed to cancer and other areas of research that are important, but they affect everybody. But we're trying to get at those specific issues that plague the veteran community. What's the process? Do y'all bring that to the VA committee or some subcommittee prior to the concrete drying on that agenda so that we can provide some input and challenge you on why you are focused on area X, Y, or Z? Dr. Clancy?
In terms of setting priorities for the research overall, we have some broad frameworks, right, that this is important to veterans' health. We are not going to fund it unless it is a veteran-focused project. I think the trickiest part is the one that you and a couple of your colleagues have keyed in on, the distinction between conditions that we know to be unique to veterans and what they're suffering right now, and conditions that are common, very prevalent among veterans, but also among other Americans as well. Creating that bright line is sometimes harder than you might think. For example, when Mr. Poliquin was asking about learning from VBA claims, which I think is a great idea, there are some exposures that have a very long latency, and we might not know without having done research. In general, we are looking to our advisory committee, to researchers themselves, to lots and lots of stakeholders, veteran service organizations, and so forth. To the best of my knowledge, we have not come to the Congress. We certainly give you reports on the other side. We could certainly make that part of a budget submission so that you would have a better sense, I think. I'm not sure how close you want to get to that. Some people might think that was politicizing things too much, as opposed to substantive interest, which has been very much the theme of today's conversation.
I think it's part of our oversight role. I mean, I think it's too late after we see the work that you're doing to suggest that it's inside or outside the purview of the mission for research at the VA. But nevertheless, I think I'm interested in how we can improve that process so we're better engaged on the front end. What percentage of the research at the VA is translational versus fundamental? Is it 50-50, Dr. Ramoni?
So that is an area that I am, as you know, keenly focused on. Currently, the majority of our research is basic research, and some of that basic research, of course, is in veteran-focused areas. For instance, non-opioid pain medication is being researched in basic science, or traumatic brain.
Just in the interest of time, and
yes.
I know I keep cutting you off, and I do apologize, but I think it's an opportunity.
Yes.
If I were there with you, I would say, where can we have a strategic advantage and focus given our strengths, et cetera, sort of SWOT analysis? I'd say we should be more translational, less basic. NIH can do basic, all these other institutes. Let's focus more on how we get at solving the problem in a quicker way. And I'd also say, can we use the inside of the the Veteran Hospital System, health system? Yes. It's the largest in the country.
That's right.
How do we tap into that like you did with telemedicine? It's why you're leading in telemedicine. That is a leadership role for the VA. How to use the patient material and all that you have with some flexibility that you don't have on the outside that my friend from Baylor College of Medicine doesn't have because of restrictions. How do you tap into that so we can translate therapies and devices so we can save lives? That's a question I have. I'm out of time, but let's talk about that. Let y'all come over to the office. I'll come see you, and let's see if we can't share some thoughts and ideas on how to.
I would welcome that.
Mr. Chairman, could I make one quick point? One area where we do take great advantage of our system, and this is just getting started, but very, very exciting. You may be aware that clinical trials are unbelievably expensive because effectively every study creates a separate infrastructure which is then disbanded. Because of our integrated system and an electronic record, we're actually now funding some point-of-care studies where patients are randomized when they are being seen for care. We're collecting data from the electronic record, which takes the cost of a clinical trial and reduces it by orders of magnitude. So we're with you and would love some follow-up.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I'm going to yield myself 5 minutes. That'll complete the second round. I think Representatives Brownlee and Custer, you have no more questions. Mr. Pollock, when you would like one more round, Mr. Arrington, would you like any more time?
I'm going to reserve mine for a meeting,
okay.
And I appreciate their comments.
All right. Dr. Clancy, just if you could take for the record, I'd really like to know how many dual appointment researchers we have across the spectrum, okay? And if you can give me a number, I assume you can give us a name. Okay, so a by name, which then would therefore assume a by location list, because I sense across the committee that there is keen interest in the how things are getting done, and not that all of you don't have, you know, all your data, you know, because you do, but it's important for us to hear it from boots on the ground as well. So I think that's going to be an important step going forward. Dr. Ramoni, Mr. Poliquin brought up problems with data sharing between VHA and VBA. What are some of the impediments to working with VBA?
Thank you for your question. So I think that the first impediment is simply an historical inertia. We simply haven't worked that much with VBA in the past, although some of our researchers now are beginning to use VBA data, for instance, in our suicide prevention work and also in our evidence-based policy group. What would need to happen is to have a data use agreement with VBA and to have that prioritized in both on the ORD side, which it certainly would be, and also on the VBA side, so that we can establish those relationships and also have that work properly staffed, because sharing data takes curation, it takes explanations of the data, it takes having some understanding from the VBA side.
Is there any ongoing institutional resistance based on the old not invented here syndrome type of thing? I mean, do we have any cultural barriers that we need to break down between VHA and VBA?
I don't think so.
I don't think there are cultural barriers. Again, it's been a sort of inertia that we need to work on both sides to break down, and I certainly am committed to do so. And as we proceed, we will of course keep this subcommittee informed. And should we encounter any of the barriers you mentioned, we're grateful for your support.
Well, we know that human behavior is such that everyone if you will, in a chain of command or a food chain, they look up to see the behavior above them. And if the leadership at all levels is not having crosstalks, cooperating across whatever boundaries might be there, the organization will emulate those qualities of their leadership. And that's why it's so important that it's kind of like, I don't know if any of you are parents, but kids watch their parents. And if the parents are talking, the kids pay attention. If the kids think the parents aren't talking, they're going to try to divide and conquer you. But we're here together in this, not to overblow the family analogy, but we are a family. We are a family that's dedicated to the results for veterans, and that's pure and simple the mission of the family. Dr. Ramoni, NAVREF's testimony asked that the VA share the scope, criteria, and assessment for the nonprofit program office's outbrief reviews. Could you please provide those to the committee as well? Second, are these outbriefs something the VA is willing to share with NAVREF? I mean, again, in the spirit of sharing information.
With the outbriefs that, excuse me, sir, the outbriefs at each NPC?
At the reviews, at the review level?
Yes. We would leave it to the discretion of the local NPC to share those because not every NPC has a relationship with NAVREF, but we have no desire to not make those publicly available. We would certainly make those available to NAVREF if we were given the permission of the NPC.
Okay, well, it's, again, it's going back to breaking down those barriers that inhibit the results and giving us the outcomes that we all are striving for. And sometimes outcomes isn't a strong enough word. It means results related to the veteran. So with that, I'm going to yield back. Mr. Poliquin, you get the third and final strike.
Thank you, sir.
Round, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I appreciate if you set that clock to 8 minutes instead of 5, but in any event. Dr. Clancy, who oversees the investigators? The reason I ask that question is my understanding, and correct me if I am mistaken, is that the investigators or researchers, I'm using investigators because that's what Dr. Ramoni taught me that word. If these individuals, I believe, are hired by the local VA hospitals around the country, so they're employees of the VA, and at the same time they might work for a terrific medical institution like at Baylor or at Harvard or at Case Western or whatever it might be. And they then have authority to apply for grants, get the grants, and then determine where the administrative dollars goes, notwithstanding what Dr. Kottman said earlier. So who is overseeing those investigators to make sure everything is going the way it should be?
Well, as Dr. Klopman pointed out earlier, there's a very careful time and attendance record. The VA actually, from the time of my earliest training.
No, I'm not really asking that, Dr. Clancy. Thank you for that. What I'm asking is there anybody looking over the investigator's shoulders to say, every time you apply for a grant, and I know you work at XYU University, that grant money goes to XYU because you're applying for that and you have to put it on the grant, but the administration also is done by that university. Is anybody serve as a check and balance to that individual?
Well,
or are we doing it now?
To some extent, we would expect the NPCs to do that. I'm going to guess that a fair amount of that is delegated to the discretion of the investigator, if I could just finish for a moment.
Sure.
If I'm splitting my time 5/8, 3/8, that would be a very common break because you have to be 5/8 funded to get VA research funding. But if I can say on my 3/8 time, I'm applying for a grant from NIH, that would be okay, the way we've been doing business.
And what I'm looking for is if you have an investigator, and what Congressman Bergman asked is a really good one. Who are these people? Where are they located? If you have 150 of them, I'm just choosing a number, I think it's probably pretty close, is that if you have 100 of them that are always doing the administrative work where they work, not at the VA, but at their research affiliate, their academic affiliate, that would be a concern of mine.
I would agree.
Okay, good. So there's no one that oversees that except us, correct?
I think you have brought a unique lens and intensity to our focus, and
Here's
I
why this
appreciate
matters.
that.
Here's why this matters, Dr. Clancy, and everybody here, is that we have a situation where there is an inherent conflict of interest. And we're looking at very big amounts of dollars, a lot of bacon. You have $1.2 billion roughly of grants that are provided by NIH and the DOD and others in 1 year. And if you say roughly, if we use our low-cost provider over here, the NPCs, right, roughly 25%, that's roughly $900 million of research, roughly, and about $300 million in 1 year of administrative overhead and so forth and so on to administrate those, oversee those grants, to make sure the research gets done. Well, what if you're overpaying? What if it's not 25%? What if it's double that, like it's been discussed here? What if it's more than that? That's another $300 million a year. So you're getting less research and more overhead. We see that everywhere, everywhere, frankly, in the nonprofit sector, not picking on anybody. That's why I want to see the data. I want to see what grants were issued, who did the research, how much money for the research, how much money for the overhead, who these investigators are, and what their record is of awarding that administrative work. And on top of that, you have the Inspector General's report that says this ain't going well. And that just came out. So I'm not trying to pick on anybody. We are all responsible for taking care of our veterans. Thank you. We're not clinicians, but it's our responsibility to make sure that the dollars are going to the right place and we're not overpaying. It's that simple. Yes.
I'd like to make a point of clarification, which is I understand what Dr. Clancy is talking about, that the NPC might have an input into where someone, a PI, would submit the grant. But the reality is that throughout the country, there's lots of times that the NPC isn't even aware that that grant is being submitted. So there's absolutely no way that the NPC could be part of it.
But 30 years ago, you folks were created by Congress specifically to solve this problem, correct?
Correct.
Well, I would like to know how much of the business you're getting because you're the low-cost provider.
We would also like to know.
Good. Pretty simple, Jack. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Am I now Chairman Jack? Is that what it is? No longer General
Whatever
Jack?
you would like, sir, as long as you
Papa
vacation
Jack is what
in Maine this summer.
So, all right. All right. Well, thank you to all the committee members for the, this has probably been one of the more focused and direct subcommittee meetings and hearings that we've had, so I appreciate everybody's input, especially all of you at the testimony table, because together we do make a difference, and we make a positive difference, and if it was all easy, it would all have been done a long time ago, and we'd be all doing other things. So I really appreciate your continued intellectual engagement here for our penchant for details now that big data allows us to get those details in a relatively expeditious and accurate manner. So our thanks to all the witnesses today. You are now excused. Ranking Member Custer, would you like to make any comments before we close?
I have a brief closing statement, and one point I'd like to leave the record open long enough for the VA to respond to the questions that have been asked today. The perspectives we heard today are important points of view to consider as we ultimately have a dramatic impact on the quality of care to our veterans in New Hampshire and all across the country, and to community providers and indeed civilians across this country. While I appreciate the hard work and dedication of the witnesses and organizations that you represent, the testimony today does concern me. I appreciate the great work that the VA Nonprofit Research and Education Corporations, or NPCs, conduct to oversee crucial VA research with frugality. However, it's concerning that the availability availability of NPCs at all VA medical centers may be limited. Likewise, I appreciate the robust academic affiliations the VA currently enjoys. And as I mentioned in my comments, Dartmouth College and Dartmouth Medical School has proven to be a wonderful partner in expanding and improving veterans' health care in rural New Hampshire. However, it concerns me that some academic institutions may charge more than necessary to administer federal research grants, and ensuring the most efficient system is crucial to maximizing resources this Congress provides to care for our veterans, and I think you've heard this as a bipartisan concern. I recognize the VA has been unable to provide clear guidance in an expeditious manner as to how this research money is to be distributed, and I encourage the VA to finalize this guidance as quickly as possible and share that with this committee. I believe there's a great opportunity here for all stakeholders to work together and ensure that VA's research regime is efficient and effective. To that end, I ask my colleagues to consider joining me in convening a roundtable of relevant stakeholders to further discuss these issues. And as I mentioned specifically, I'd love to include the bipartisan heroin task force and both committees to engage in this discussion. Our experience with the opioid epidemic has made effective medical research, especially into pain management and substance use disorder, an acute concern of members across this country. We know the importance of getting new research on pain, addiction, and mental health is important. Veterans are uniquely impacted by the opioid epidemic because over 50% of veterans experience chronic pain. Our veterans need the latest in medical research to combat this problem, and I hope to advance legislation soon that would centralize and improve pain management at the VA by creating centers of excellence. Of course, this is hardly the only area in need of additional research. I know veterans with upper body prosthetic needs experience a limited suite of options. Creation of a center of excellence on bionics or upper prosthetics is needed to further meet the needs of veterans. There is emerging research in technology, and as I appreciate your mention in your opening remarks about the Luke arm, but assuring that the VA is adequately able to deploy the latest technology is crucial to improving our veterans' quality of life. So this serves to underscore my commitment to delivering the highest quality of care to our veterans by ensuring that the VA remains a leader in medical research. I thank you for your time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Custer. It has been nearly 1 year after our research hearing last June, and it quite frankly does not appear that the VA has made any improvements on its utilization of the NPCs. Budgets are still tight, yet we continue to find examples of VA not utilizing the available options for additional funds. As we have heard, NPCs have contributed over $2 billion, that'd be with a B, to VA research over the past decade, and could contribute more if they were to administer the grants for research projects conducted within VA. VA should not be paying overhead costs without getting the benefit of reimbursement. It is also critical that the research office have access to VBA's data so that it may better meet its mission of veteran-centric research. This data would be extremely beneficial in determining what diseases and disorders to examine and help guide ongoing projects. I hope that our discussion today will open the door to better communications because, quite frankly, I'm pretty tired, and I think we all are, of hearing about missed opportunities within VA due to one office not communicating with another. VA's research budget exceeds $1 billion annually, so one would think that the accomplishments it has contributed to veterans and the American public would be many. But what we have heard here today is that that is not the case. Certainly, VA can tout some major accomplishments over the past several years, but unfortunately, they are not necessarily in areas significant to veterans or related to their service. Moreover, many of these results are being implemented at only one medical center or one VISN, which limits the benefits received by veterans across the country. Simply put, VA research needs to be more focused on specific conditions prevalent among our nation's veterans, and the department must follow through on projects so that there are actual clinical benefits to show for all of the funding the research program receives. So bang for the buck. It is past time to witness the urgency this long-standing problem deserves. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. Without objection, so ordered. I would once again like to thank all of our witnesses and audience members for joining in today's conversation. With that, this hearing is adjourned.